Everyone has heard or knows of the Beatles, but why? What makes them so special? Today I'm going to tell you on how and why the Beatles became one of the most influential bands of all time and considered by many the greatest band of all time. It all started in 1957 when Paul McCartney and John Lennon met at a garden party. They found out that they both had common interests. They both had a love for American rock and roll. They both loved Elvis Presley and the way that he shook his hips. They also liked Buddy Holly, who wrote his own songs, and Chuck Berry because of the way he played the guitar. Oh boy. After they met, Paul knew of a guy named George Harrison, who ended up being the lead guitarist for the band. Those core three stuck together for many years, playing for a band called the Quarrymen. They finally got a label because they met a man named George Martin, who thought they had a chance to make it big. There was only one problem though. They did not like their drummer. Came in Ringo Starr. After Ringo Starr came in, they made their first release, Love Me Do, which made them become mainstream throughout UK. After that came out their first album, Please Please Me, which put them up throughout the charts, which then made them lead to go into America, where they went on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 7th, 1964, where 74 million people watched the Beatles play live on the Ed Sullivan Show. This event sparked the beginning of one of the greatest bands of all time. For their success, the Beatles became one of the most successful bands of all time. According to the Guinness World Record book, the Beatles hold 21 number one hits. 11 of their 12 albums were number one on the national charts. The Beatles are the best-selling group ever, selling over 1 billion units in the world. They have the most U.S. number one albums. They also held a record for the most songs in the top 10 at one time until Drake broke it in 2018. As the Beatles grew up, their music became more sophisticated and complex. They started out playing simple rock and roll songs that were about love, like they were more like he loves she loves him kind of songs. But as they grew up, they became more complex. They met Bob Dylan in 1964, and Bob Dylan introduced them to a little thing called marijuana. Later, the Beatles came out with an album, Rubber Soul, which later, in 1972, John Lennon joked about as that being the weed album. This album was very different from all the others that the Beatles have made. It was more complex, more sophisticated music. Later on, the Beatles got into a drug called acid. Their album Revolver reflects that their acid trips, and their music was very different in Revolver than any other album. While touring, the Beatles noticed that the crowds that they were playing at were too loud, they couldn't even hear themselves play. They felt almost like a circus, so they decided to stop touring and putting all their efforts into making music, which came Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Island Band, which is considered by the Rolling Stones magazine the greatest album of all time. Why, you may ask? It's because of the complexity and the difference of music that has never came out before. They got a lot of their inspiration from classical and Indian music that made the album. From these differences of sound that they have developed many influences. Many bands today, like Imagine Dragons, Oasis, Panic at the Disco, and even Hendrix and David Bowie credit the Beatles as their main influences. What made them so influential? It was the differences, the experiments that the Beatles made in their sound. The Beatles made music that no one has ever heard before, and people wanted to replicate that uniqueness. Bringing in classical, bringing in different instruments. It was revolutionary at the time. Sadly, as the years went on, the Beatles grown tired of each other. Always touring, making music, tensions were tight. when they made their White Album, their largest album, so long that they made 2 parts of it, most of the songs weren't even recorded. They didn't even record them together. They recorded them at different times where they weren't even in the same studio at the same time. Then came Abbey Road and Let It Be, and eventually the Beatles decided that they're going to break apart. They played their last performance live was on a rooftop on top of Abbey Road Studios, where they announced it last second in London, and everyone gathered around and watched them perform for the last time. Little did everyone know it was going to be their last time. Though after the band broke up, there was still optimism in the 70s. But when some crazy man killed John Lennon, all those hopes were gone. At that moment, everyone knew that the Beatles would never be together again. So in conclusion, though it was a short run of 8 years, the Beatles broke records, sold many albums, and were a great influence and changed music forever. Thank you.